All right. Okay, so now I'm going to show you guys how to do the shading. I'm going to just pick an object and start on that one object and work through it. I will refer to the cross contour part that we just did as we were doing this. So I'm just going to pick a single object to show you and shade the space on the object and around the object, okay? So I'm going to pick the green pear, which wasn't even in my drawing. The thing you need to remember about light and shadow, well, there's a few things. First off, we have the still life lit now. The way it wasn't lit this way before when we were doing the composition because it wasn't important to the composition necessarily. But you guys might end up having to set up your own still life. In fact, it's likely that that's what you're going to have to do. And I know it's a drag because you guys already started with the midterm drawing in class, and that would mean starting completely over. But I don't see any way around that. So when we set up a still life, I started making mention of that before, we want to have a variety of forms, and they want to be somewhat volumetric. You don't want to have flat things, you want to have rounded things. So like box forms wouldn't be the greatest thing to choose. Things like what you see in front of you here. When I set up a still life, I like to have it below my eye level. That is me looking down on it. And I also like to have, when I'm doing the composition, which I didn't mention this when we were doing the composition, that I like to see the bottoms of the objects, so showing the surface plane to show you where things are located in space. So when I'm lighting the still life, what you guys notice is that there's light on one side of the object. So if you look at the teapot, there's light on one side of the teapot, there's shadow on the other side of the teapot, right? So that helps give you the illusion of form. If you don't do that, you can light this in a whole bunch of different ways. Like you could light it on the top, or you could light it from behind. And if you do that, it'll get in the way of showing you the illusion of form when you're actually looking at the still life. So it's hard for you to get an illusion of form if it doesn't look that way in the actual still life. So for the still life, we want to have it lit, so you have light on one side, shadow on the other side. We are going to eventually be going into light logic more deeply when we do the charcoal drawing. I am going to mention terms, though, as we're doing this, that will then come up again when we are doing light logic with the charcoal drawing. But what you're going to need to understand is there's going to be value in the entire drawing. There is going to be nothing in the drawing that is going to be just simply white paper, other than the margins around the drawing. So when I'm doing the green pear, there are light spots on the green pear, but the green pear doesn't, those light spots on the green pear aren't going to be as light as the light spots, say, on the teapot. The light spots on the teapot, we call them highlights. The highlights on the teapot are the only place where you're going to have absolutely white paper. Everything else is going to have value on it, all right? So when I have my object here, the green pear, I'm going to start using a single direction hatching stroke, and I'm going to shade in a base value. So I'm not going to be referring to the cross contour drawing of it, but the cross contour drawing of the pear, I'll just put the cross contour drawing of this pear up here. So we'll have that as a reference. What you're going to have is your actual cross contour drawing to refer to. So there's the cross contour drawing of the pear. Okay, so starting off, I'm using the 2B graphite pencil. I've been using the 2B graphite pencil all along. I'm sorry I did not say that earlier. And so I'm doing a single direction hatching stroke right now on top of the pear. Now, behind the pear is white paper, but even that white paper isn't going to be white, so it's going to have a value on it as well. So I can go ahead and go over. The outside contours of my pear. And then the values around the pear are going to be darker on that where the brown paper is. So I'm using the side of the lead on my pencil. I'm not using the point of the lead. And as long as I don't change direction, I can keep going over that and it won't get darker. As long as I don't change the amount of pressure I'm putting on the pencil, like we did when we were doing the grid drawing. Okay, so there's a basic value. Now I'm going to be looking at the actual form shadow on the pear. And I'm going to just change direction now. And I'm starting to get the shadow side now of the pear. So this is going to start light and get darker as it progresses. I'm doing a little bit of form following now as I'm crossing over, but we'll do more of that in a second. So now I have a basic shadow side, basic light side of the object. Then this is going to be where the edge of the paper is, the brown paper. Now, on the pear, we have some areas where we've got some highlights. So I am kind of marking out where those highlights are going to go. About here, and about here. So that means it's darker around those highlights. So now I'm going to start to shade the light side. But leave those highlights light. And so you can kind of see right in here, there's the highlight. That was that base value. So I'll highlight here and I'll highlight here. And you can see now the light side is darker than my shadow side, but I'm going to keep going over. So I'm going to come on to where my shadow side is, my form shadow. And that should get darker, but if it doesn't, we will make it darker. So far we've only been using the side of the pencil lead. Now we're going to start to use the point of the lead. So with my, looking at my cross contour drawing, I'm going to start to shade in the direction that I made those cross contours. That's why we did the cross contour. So the cross contour helps to establish form. It helps you to see the form that we have in front of us. Bring it around here like that. If you need to rotate your paper to help facilitate the mark making, that is fine. Cross contours don't need to just go one direction, they can come around the other direction as well, just like we did before. So now coming around this way. There's also a little bit in here where it gets a little bit darker as the form is coming around. It just helps to bring out our highlight a little bit more. So right in here, we have a bit of a coarse shadow. What that means is the shadow appears to be a little bit darker in this area. Basically, we've talked about the highlights, the light, shadow. We also have the cast shadow of the object. So the object is interrupting the light source, and it's throwing a shadow. I need to make this darker, where we have our surface plane. I'm going to get back to that base tone again. I didn't go far enough. So remember, even in here, we had some value, and you can't really even tell anymore because of the contrast between the object and what we put down on the surface plane originally. And then the cast shadow is getting interrupted by an object over here. Okay, so cast shadow. The thing about cast shadows that you have to remember is if you mess up on them, and that is put them in the wrong place, people are going to notice that. The other thing you have to figure out when you're looking at your still life is you got to figure out, is the cast shadow darker than the form shadow, or is it lighter? It could be both. I mean, it could be either. Let me put it that way. So looking at the pair right now, I can see that the form shadow side is a little bit darker than what's going on in the cast shadow. Now, this is something that students are always stressing out about. They can't, or they claim that they can't tell which is darker. What I do is when I'm looking at the still life, if I just sort of blur my vision when I'm looking at the still life, it makes it clear to me what is lighter, what is darker, okay? So as I do that, I can tell that this part is actually darker than this part, okay? So now I'm going to shade my cast shadow. And remember the horizontal edges that we had on our surface plane when I did the cross contour. Since this value is lighter, right, than the actual object, I can shade right into the object. Now, the cast shadow is darker than the form shadow right at the bottom here. So now I'm looking to use the point of my pencil. I'm still using the 2B graphite. If I wanted to kick it up to the 4B or the 6B, I could probably do that. I wouldn't do it at this point because I would want to get the whole still life, basic values of the whole still life on there before I start figuring out what needs to be darker object to object. For example, the green pair I'm doing now, the lights on the green pair are going to be not as light as the lights on, say, the teapot or on some of the gourds or even on the yellow pair. So there's this little part here where we're getting a crossover from, I think, another light source. I'm going to bring up the core shadow a little bit more in here. And then I have what I believe is a reflected shadow right in here. And these terms, you don't need to remember right now, but you're going to need to remember eventually. I'm going to need to get this darker because like right in here in my form shadow, you'll notice that there's areas within the pear in the form shadow that appear lighter. And that's because they are. Those are called reflected lights. So we're talking about this and this. Light is bouncing off of objects, or it could be bouncing off of the surface plane into the object so that you see areas where it gets a little bit lighter. Now, again, blurring my vision, I know that because we have the brown paper here, the brown paper is darker than the white paper back in here. So this area in here is going to have to get darker as well. So right now the contrast between the cast shadow and the brown paper itself may be stronger than it needs to be. We'll see. So now I'm going to start to shade that paper a little bit darker. I mean, it's not dark because it is getting, light on it. The brown paper that we have this still life sitting on is a little bit darker than I would like. The person who did the ordering ordered the wrong thing. Stuff happens. So now that's going to be important on this side though, because this is going to provide a contrast to the light part of the object. So as I'm shading now, I'm shading, and this is no darker than that, right? But the contrast between the light side of the object and the shadow side, you can see by shading the surface area or the surface plane that that is helping to pop out the light part of the object, which may not have been as obvious before. So we're going to have to punch that contrast up a little bit more. The other thing that you will hear me saying, if you ever get into a class situation again, is that I need to sharpen on the edges without drawing an outline, okay? So again, I'm going to be shading away from the object. So you're going to see me do that here, where I have to put the point of the pencil next to the object and shade away, and that helps to get the sharpness of the edge without getting an outline. Because ultimately, when you're seeing the value drawing there, you don't want to have outlines on the value drawing. And right now this is darker on this side than it is on that side, but we will need to adjust that. So now you can see it starting to pop out. There is a bit more shadow here underneath the object. here as I darken the surface plane, I don't need to worry about shading away from the edge because it's not as dark as the shadow side there. But I am going to want to make the cast shadow darker still. And as I'm doing this, there are, believe it or not, reflected lights within the cast shadows too. So there's going to be some light areas in here, or lighter. Now so far all I've been doing is the actual form. There is some differences in pigmentation on this thing. That means that there's some splotches and things like that on the pear. Even though that pear is a plastic pear, it still is a fairly convincing plastic pear. So this part here is darker. The only thing you need to worry about is when you've got something that, like, there's a brown top to this, right? So it gets a little bit darker in here. You just want to make sure that it's not going to get confused with actual shadow. Form shadow, that is. So that when I have some splotches and stuff down here, I can put those in. And there's still some in the shadow side as well. So you can start to get some of that stuff happening. The thing you also need to remember is that the shadow on the object is as important as the shadows or the values behind the object. So you want to make sure that you're not just shading each object and leaving the rest empty. You want to start to see what those values are going to look like next to the objects. It's important that you do the two things simultaneously. The other thing that it's going to be important that you do is you may notice that when I'm shading, I'm using the side of my pencil and I'm holding my pencil further back. I'm not resting my hand on the paper. And if I do have to rest my hand on the paper, then I want to get another piece of paper underneath my hand so that I'm not going to be rubbing and smudging the drawing, okay? Because you may have noticed that at no point in time was I smudging anything on here. I wasn't using a blending stomp or smudging this with my finger, and I don't want you to do that. If you do that, what will end up happening is that you'll end up with something that's kind of, that looks blurry, okay, rather than sharp. And you can see there's a sharpness to the value that's happening in here that you would lose if you were trying to do it with a blending stomp. We will be doing that. We will ultimately be using blending when we get into charcoal. But for right now, I want all the value to happen optically. Here you can see I'm resting my hand in the drawing, but it's not where I have any drawing yet, so I can get away with that. But this would be an instance where I would have to have paper underneath, okay? Okay, so that's the value part. You can see the value part's going to take a long time. So you'll have that cross contour drawing as a reference. You'll be shading the entire thing like what you see in there. That's why we want to get to the shading part as soon as possible. When we were talking about the cross contour drawing and checking for proportion, that is what takes people the longest amount of time a lot of times. So you want to try to get that. You want to be able to understand what we were doing when we were using the stick and doing the comparative measurement. Without that, you're not going to be able to get the drawing in proportion. So that's going to be the the important thing, because you're getting graded on the ability to have the drawing in proportion, the ability to get the illusion of form when you're doing the value, and the illusion of form when you're doing the cross contour. So that's sort of the point of all this. In total, the drawing is going to be worth 20 points for the cross contour drawing, and it's going to be worth 50 points for the value part, you know. And when we're doing the value part, you want to make sure that your margins of the frame, that those stay clean. I'm not as concerned about the cleanliness of the cross contour drawing, because that is the drawing where you're figuring everything out. You don't have to suffer about proportion and comparative measurement when you're doing the value, because that's already been decided when you were doing the cross contour drawing. Okay? Okay, so value drawing should take, I would say, maybe about 6 hours total of drawing time. The cross contour really should take no more than 2 hours. I mean, you saw me do the whole thing, so it shouldn't take more than 2 hours, right, to get the cross contour drawing figured out, okay? So let's see what you can come up with.